What's going on, guys? Dan Weichart here with Weichart Media. Look, we're going to make an effort to come back to you guys on a regular basis here on YouTube, on Rumble, on Instagram, and on Twitter, just so we can constantly be in front of you guys and start chatting with you, because we know you guys are out there and we love you. So we're going to jump right into it. As you can probably guess by the subject of the title, you may have heard in the news that a large wildfire just absolutely crushed Lahaina specifically, but really Maui generally in Hawaii. And the reason I want to bring this up is that, quite frankly, the individuals who hold the most responsibility are doing their darndest to sweep this under the rug and move right along with life, so that they don't have to actually answer for the failures that this is ultimately the result of. Because at the end of the day, one thing that it seems that both liberals and conservatives can agree on about this particular topic is that the death toll and the destruction wrought by the wildfires in Maui are largely the result of a catastrophic failure of government systems. So more on that. And that's why I really want to touch in on this. But let me give you guys a brief timeline as to what's going on or what had happened, and then we kind of roll from there. So let me drag this up. Transition. All right, here we are. So starting from the beginning, really about the evening of the 8th of August, you start seeing winds and things like that pick up. So you start seeing high winds. So high winds are a bit of a problem because, as you know, as soon as fires get started, you start fanning those flames. Those flames can quickly get out of control. And so high winds and dry conditions are ripe for wildfires. And then, of course, toward the evening of the 9th, or excuse me, evening of the 8th, we start seeing some first indications that there's going to be an issue. Really on into, by 9:45 p.m. on the evening of the 9th, or excuse me, the 8th, Mayor of Lahaina issues a full emergency. And so you can see and hear from the picture, or you can see here from the picture, that, they've really got a problem going on by this point. As you're scrolling down, as we get into the 9th, they begin fighting these fires throughout August 9th. So firefighting crews continue to battle in Lahaina. So the destruction continues to pull out by the end of the 10th. Again, the fires continue on. People continue to fight it. And they really fight it all the way through the 13th of August. Until really about the 13th or 14th, most of the fires are deemed out. So as I point this stuff out, there's a couple of things that we want to start off with. Number one, it seems as though one of the primary issues was mismanagement of forestry along with mismanagement of resources. So, for example, apparently there are a lot of overgrown areas in Hawaii generally, and this seems to be the result largely of mostly environmental groups who are non-residential to Hawaii, who keep lobbying the local governments, the state government in particular, to prevent controlled burns in some of Hawaii's brushes and forests, so as to preserve their natural beauty. And while that is to a certain degree admirable, the reality of the fact is, when you look at what happens in nature, yes, absolutely, the forest will grow naturally, beautifully to a certain degree. But then once the conditions are right, as they were this past during the week of the 8th, wildfires break out. And then what happens is you have massive uncontrolled burns of a wildfire, resulting in a lot of the destruction that you saw here in Lahaina. Now, back in the day, we didn't really care because it was just a forest that burned down. But now we're talking about people's homes and the lives of hundreds of people at this point. Potentially thousands is what we're expecting. So there's about 2,000 people that are still listed as unaccounted for as of yesterday, about 115 deaths that have been officially announced. So we expect that death toll to rise as investigations uncover more remains. And that's not to say anything of the hundreds or thousands of homes and businesses which were destroyed. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is that apparently also in pursuit of sort of a green agenda, there appears to have been diversion of resources. So, for example, a lot of firefighters had a hard time containing the fires as quickly as they possibly could have, simply because water had been diverted away from those areas for use. And this is, again, in the effort of resource preservation. Think what you will of that, but it certainly seems to be a foolish thing to shortchange the fire department on water. So that's that. Once you get past the initial setup of everything, then we have the actual fire itself, which of course was devastating, the botched evacuation, and now as we're seeing in the aftermath, the absolutely mismanaged and mishandled recovery effort and support that these people are receiving from their state and federal officials. So regarding the early warning systems, as we're going into the initial fire component, one of the key things that people highlighted upon was the fact that Maui's or Hawaii's siren alert system was not triggered in order to warn people away from the fires themselves. Right. So they weren't triggered to warn people away from the fires themselves. And there seems to be conflicting data on this. So Maui's emergency leader resigned, citing health reasons, a day after claiming it didn't matter that his team set off the island's sirens, this is according to the Daily Mail of the UK. So as we scroll down, the head of Maui's emergency management, after Chief Herman Andaya faced fierce backlash by saying he did not regret not activating the early warning siren. So what did happen during the night of the fire is that radio, television, and cell phone alerts were sent out to individuals on the island. However, the most, call it widespread available warning system, the sirens, which are located predominantly along the coastline, were not sounded. Chief Andaya here claimed that the reason they didn't do that is they feared that people having heard the sirens and apparently being conditioned to respond to those sirens as meaning that a tsunami was imminent would then go up the mountain of the island, running themselves directly into the fire. Now, that seems strange. So one of the key things that I was asking myself about this particular choice was actually, was there apparently any indication that people would in fact respond this way if the sirens were sounded? Now, it doesn't appear that that's the case. I did a solid 2 hours worth of research trying to figure out this one question, because the siren question was the one that was really interesting to me. And I was like, well, look, is this actually the case? Because I can certainly see the logic. If you have a siren that when it sounds, people traditionally have always, or at least mostly, heard that siren in context of a tsunami, it makes sense that they would then travel uphill to escape a tsunami, uphill into the fire department, up in the fire. And a lot of people make the comment, well, hey, people aren't dumb. And I was like, well, no, a person is smart. This is a quote, I believe, from the old Men in Black movie. Tommy Lee Jones says this to Will Smith's character. A person is smart. People are dumb, stupid, and panicky. And so in the situation of a crisis, people tend to do things that are irrational. And so I could easily see someone who, if they are actually conditioned to respond to this siren by going uphill, to go uphill regardless of what they start to see around them. Because we'll see evidence in the rest of this tragedy of people who have just failed to, they don't respond with the evidence that's right in front of their eyes. They operate by preconceived notions regardless of what's happening in front of them. And we'll get to what I mean by that here in a minute. But the long and short of it is I couldn't find any evidence to suggest that people were in fact conditioned to do this. In fact, I kind of found a lot of the opposite. Not only was that seemed to be not the case, the sirens seemed to be predominantly used as a method by which people would understand, hey, there's a problem, and we need to seek more information as opposed to anything else. And this also seems to be the case when you talk, various experts have weighed in on this topic as well, saying that maybe people understand why it was chosen that, these individuals did not sound the siren, but the conventional wisdom is that in the event of emergency, all warning systems should be deployed so that you have the chance for the maximum possible reach. Because some individuals claim that even though the radio, television, and cell phone warnings were sent out, they didn't receive those because of poor signal, which is something you really can't account for. However, if you start blasting a siren, you can usually hear those, especially because the islands of Hawaii are actually not that big in terms of their square footage, square mileage, I should say. So high probability that they could have easily been heard. So that's one issue that was looked into. It does seem to be the case that the siren should have been sounded, and this is something that should have been known. And what I suspect is that in the in the midst of the panic of this horrible tragedy, the responsible officials simply choked. They saw what was going on. They panicked, overthought the situation, did not deploy the appropriate responses, which seems all the more egregious when you consider that Maui and Hawaii, generally speaking, had been warned of this previously. Little known fact, Hawaii did have a wildfire back in 2018. Now, thankfully, that one was relatively minor, comparatively speaking. But this was warned, the setup of this was warned well in advance, saying, hey, look, this is possible again. You need to be open to that. And then if you actually review Hawaii's emergency response page, the sirens are used for a multitude of natural disasters, including tsunamis, hurricanes, wildfires, bombing attacks. Their original purpose was to warn of attacks by sea during World War II. So it goes back a long time, and they have been used to warn against a bevy of things. So it seems strange that it wasn't deployed here. And it just seems like a stupid decision that was made by people who were panicking that were supposed to be responsible officials. Nevertheless, that's how it shook out. And it seems that many people died where they could potentially have not have. Following that, we then go into what appears to be the pretty insane evacuation policy, or not policy, I should say, events around evacuation, which strangely enough seem to be divided along political lines. And I'll go ahead and switch over and show you what I'm talking about here. Right. So, strangely enough, one of the funny things I came across was on Reddit, which is Reddit's typically a pretty left-leaning social media platform. I found two articles dealing with the evacuation of the Maui and Lahaina areas. So Maui police blocked access to the main highway in Lahaina, the only road out of town, creating a gridlock situation where no one could get out in time. And they kind of show this diagram here. So you see the fire's origins, the main roads going through here, and the choke points that were laid out there. Now, strangely enough, this one's led over into conspiracy theories on Reddit, which is seemingly very strange. By the same token, you can pop over here onto Daily Wire, which if you're conservative, you don't have any doubts with Daily Wire, typically speaking, but the reporting is typically pretty good, whether you're conservative or not. They definitely have a conservative bias, but I really don't see how reporting on blockages of fire or resources is conservative or liberal. Regardless, survivors of the Maui fire that swept through the town of Lahaina report that the only paved road out of town was barricaded by authorities at the time. So Maui Police Chief John Pelletier, let me pull it up here, give you a highlight. John Pelletier said during a news conference that residents were not prevented from fleeing Lahaina, but accounts from some of the survivors suggest they were hindered from making a quick escape because of the decision to close. I'm not even going to begin to pronounce this particular word. Hanoapalani Highway, I guess, and bypass the south end of the town. Witnesses who survived the blaze said that traffic had quickly backed up as residents attempted to flee south, but the road was blocked as the crew worked on downed power lines. One family ignored the barricade and swerved past the cones placed in the road, making it safely to another town nearly an hour later. Now, the critical component that I'll bring up here is that allegedly these roads were blocked off in response to downed power lines. Now, there are some, if you go researching this topic, what you'll discover is that these downed power lines were allegedly dead and had posed no real danger to the public. Apparently, earlier on in the day, schools had actually been canceled because of power outages for this exact reason. So it seems to have been known that the lines were dead. Now, I'm not sure why this is being labeled as some sort of conspiracy theory. It seemed like the road indeed was blocked. And what likely has happened is that the road was blocked because power lines were down. Well, power lines are down are not nearly as dangerous as a raging inferno chasing you down from behind. So it seems to make the most sense that individuals, you would think, okay, I've got power lines, I've got fire. Let's let people pass the power lines in order to escape the fire. That's what you would think. And this is what I was referencing earlier, where people will operate by their preconceived notions far sooner than they will operate by new and conflicting evidence presented to their face. Here's a great example, because apparently police were ordered to blockade this road for fear of public safety dealing with downed power lines, which we now know in retrospect were likely dead. Now, even if they were alive, by the way, as an aside, you can slowly drive over downed power lines so long as you don't kick the power lines up into your vehicle. High probability that you're going to be safe. Now, you shouldn't just do that for kicks and giggles, but in an emergency situation, you can do that. You just can. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just saying that in an emergency situation, use your best judgment, so on and so forth. But that's a thing that you can do. Your tires are made out of rubber. I digress. So in an effort to do this, individuals say, hey, block this road. There's downed power lines. Doesn't matter that the power lines were dead. They could have been live. But then if you're a police officer barricading a road and you see a crowd of people or a line of people backed up against your barricade, and then just beyond them you see a raging inferno making its way up the cars, because in retrospect now we found cars with bodies of men, women, and children in there just burned alive in their vehicles because they had to sit and wait in traffic effectively, which seems ridiculous in hindsight. So what do we see? People who were told, hey, it's unsafe to pass through here because of downed power lines, preconceived notion. Fire presented itself, completely ignored until it was too late. Until it became absolutely too late. The evidence was so overwhelming that the police themselves probably had to run. So what do we have here? Again, a failure in communication. Power company doesn't communicate with the emergency management services, who don't communicate with the police department, and then all the way down to the individual officers just don't exercise good judgment as they're sitting there. And I wasn't there, right? So I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking the cops, so there might be extingent circumstances that I'm not really aware of. But generally speaking, I would think that if you're seeing a fire running toward you, you should probably open up the road. So botched evacuation. Following that, we're on to the 13th. The fire is raged. Finally, it gets put out. And then you have FEMA and whoever else come in to try and offer aid. Well, this has been an outright disaster. If you've read the news on this at all, FEMA and whomever else have promised the people of Lahaina $700 whole dollars to help them out. Which, gosh, I guess $700 is better than nothing, but the fact that it does so little in the face of such wanton destruction that it almost seems like it's a spit in the face. You know what I mean? It almost seems like, to use the example, somebody's on fire and you piss on them to put it out. It just doesn't quite track with the point of all that. Regardless, even then, that $700 has been doled out to some residents of Lahaina and Maui generally, but definitely not to everyone who is affected. On top of that, we also see what appears to be a pretty massive land grab by some corporate entities, particularly BlackRock, who are attempting to buy up this land from the people who have since deceased. Because if you don't know the history of this place, it's a really nice area. Quite frankly, it could be, if you owned it and you so desired, you could probably utilize it to build up a pretty hefty resort for tourist attractions. However, people live there. And so they've long since rebelled or resisted any infiltration by corporate entities in order to build up the area. Well, now they're dead. So the vultures of BlackRock take no time in picking clean the bones of this particular carcass. So that's a whole separate issue, I suppose. Nevertheless, President Biden stopped by about 13 days later, and you can search the news for all the gaps of that. Just doesn't quite seem like a great response, all in all. And potentially the most galling aspect of the whole thing is simply the fact that now that the media has begun to dry up, and this really rotates me back to the whole impetus for talking about this subject, the media on is drying up. The story's kind of coming and going. People are like, oh, no, horrible fire in Maui, thoughts and prayers. And thoughts and prayers are great and all, but the media coverage is drying up and simply going away. And that's exactly what the people in power wanted to happen, because at the end of the day, what you have here in Maui and in Lahaina specifically is a critical failure of local and state government emergency responses to this situation. Failures in communication, failures in alert, failures in evacuation process, failures in common sense from top to bottom. The officials in power have been in power for a very long time, got comfortable, and they don't want to be held responsible for what is happening. They don't want to be made to pay for their mistakes, quite literally in this case. And that's what's happening. At the end of the day, the people who are turning out to help the locals in Lahaina are local organizations, local charities, local nonprofits, local organizations who are raising money and donating food and things like this. Why are they doing this? Because they're local. Which brings me really to the final point that I really want to make with this whole thing is that bottom line, you should not trust your state government for the most part. You should not trust the federal government least of all. And the reason being is because these entities not only will screw you over, because they will, they have to screw you over. They have to screw somebody over a lot. And it doesn't necessarily matter where you are. At some point, that might end up coming down to you getting screwed over. And let me explain what I mean here. Let me give you a hypothetical. Imagine there's a city out there, and that city is divided into, let's say 7 zones. And a natural disaster is bearing down on that city. And let's imagine the people in power are benevolent and they have good information to work with, which is a huge stretch for people in power to begin with. But let's assume that for a second. In a major metropolitan area, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of lives that are at stake in the event of a natural disaster on a city like that. So let's imagine a benevolent and well-informed individual who's a leader looks at this situation, sees this natural disaster bearing down on our hypothetical city, and they realize, okay, if I say nothing, this natural disaster is going to destroy the city and kill everybody in it. That's a problem. Obviously, we can't do that. If I tell everybody blanket, you need to get out of the city, well, what's going to happen is everyone in the city is going to try to leave simultaneously. It's going to flood the points of egress in the city space, egress meaning points of exit. Going to flood the points of egress, clogging them up, and we're still going to have a massive loss of life. But let's imagine I tell zones 1 through 4 to shelter in place, and then I tell zones 5 through 7 to evacuate. High probability that zones 5 through 7 can pretty much safely make it out of the city, resulting in more lives saved than if I simply tell everybody to evacuate. The question is, what is the moral decision? Do I say nothing? Do I tell everybody to evacuate? Or do I evacuate zones 5 through 7, telling 1 through 4 to shelter in place? The correct answer to that scenario, if you're a leader in power, is the last option. You save as many lives as humanly possible. That's what you have been ideally in the representative republic, selected by your peers and elevated to a position of power and authority to do, to make tough calls. This is part and parcel of the tough call that very similar to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Yes, it cost the lives of several 100,000 innocent civilians. However, it spared the lives of a bunch of American soldiers. To kind of drive that point home to you, to this day, we are still handing out Purple Hearts, which were made during that time in history, in the expectation of how many people would be injured or killed in the taking of the mainland of Tokyo, or in Japan specifically. The mainland Japan, Tokyo specifically, I should say. That's what leaders are to do. If you're an objective viewer of a situation like this, you may also have the utilitarian approach. Well, hey, look, more lives were saved in the long run than would have been through any other option. This is the option that saved the most lives. You may also make that assumption. Now, but let's imagine that this order is given, but you're sitting in zone 3. You're one of the zones that's been told to shelter in place. Is it still a moral decision? Maybe you think to yourself, oh yeah, Dan, I'm an idealist. I'm going to sit here in the comfort of this hypothetical and say that as a citizen, as a good citizen, I would simply sit there and die because I know more people will be saved by my sitting there and dying. Well, that's stupid and divorced from reality. If you're sitting in zone 3, you'd probably want to get out. You're not going to feel good about that. If you're the family of somebody in zone 3, you're not going to feel good about that. So what does that bring us to? What does that bring us to? It's moral for a public official, especially if they're actually benevolent and well-informed, which again is massive stretch, to sacrifice some lives to the benefit of the majority. This goes back to the whole, if you're a fan of Star Trek, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Even if few constitutes hundreds of thousands of lives and many constitutes millions of lives potentially. Still catastrophic, still a horrible tragedy either way. That decision is moral. So what I would tell you as the individual listening here is the government not only does not generally care about you as a person, both because the people of government are selfish, narcissistic, lazy turds, who really have no other good other than to sap and suckle at the government teat. Not only is that the case, so they're certainly not mostly the benevolent leaders that we would hope they are. They are also not working with perfect information. So even if the government were benevolent and working with good information, you still shouldn't trust them. And so you definitely shouldn't trust them given the fact that most of them are lazy do-nothings and they are working with piss-poor information to begin with and inefficient systems, to add a third wrinkle to it. So in a situation in my hypothetical city, you're in zone 3, use your best judgment. See what you're doing. Many residents of Lahaina noticed what was going on and bounced out of there ASAP, regardless of any early warning system or not. You should take a similar lesson in the future. Don't trust these guys. Don't lean on the government to protect you. The best person that's going to safeguard you and care about you as an individual, or really care about you and your family, is staring you back in the mirror. That's the best person. The next best available person to care about you and your family is the small, tight-knit community that you should be creating or should be forging relationships with in your local area, whether that be through your church or whatever. Ideally, indeed, it would be through your church. But it doesn't matter for the most part. If it's your neighborhood, if it's your HOA, for Christ's sake, I don't care. Your neighborhood watch. Form those groups so that you actually can help each other and get everybody out of there. Because those people are going to care about you, and that's exactly what's happening in Lahaina. The local groups are taking care of the locals. And if you're out there and you're not from Hawaii, at the end of the day, the best thing you can do if you really want to help these individuals, apparently tickets to Maui are super cheap right now. Flights are cheap, hotels are cheap, because they're telling everybody not to show up. Well, turns out that the biggest industry in Maui is tourism. So they need people to show up and occupy these resorts, go to restaurants, buy trinkets or whatever, take tours. They need people to do these things so they can make money and actually continue to survive and rebuild their place. That's their chief industry. So if you've ever thought about you want to go to Maui, now's a great time to do it. Now's a great time. But long story short, you shouldn't trust the government because not only don't they generally care about you, because like I said, they're generally lazy do-nothings, they cannot care about you. Even if they were benevolent and well-informed, they can't care about you. They can't care about you because at the end of the day, they have millions of lives at stake. So you can trust yourself, trust your best judgment. Using my hypothetical, if you're in zone 3 and you see a natural disaster bearing down on you and the government tells you to shelter in place, flip those suckers the bird and get out of the city. Figure it out. Figure it out. Tell your friends and family, you know what? This is BS. I'm out of here. And hopefully you can take some of your friends and family. You definitely take your family with you. Hopefully some of your friends will join you. But don't trust the government. Otherwise, you get stuff like what happened in Lahaina, where a lot of people depended on these governments and early warning systems to respond. And if they didn't, are depending on the government to come back around and help them out. The government doesn't care. Because and that goes back to the original point. The local governments of Lahaina and Maui, generally speaking, and the state government of Hawaii are kind of riding out the media storm until it's over, and then they're peacing out and letting corporate entities such as BlackRock pick clean the bodies of the individuals left behind, both their homes land, in order to make benefit off of it. I'm sure there's kickbacks to it. Don't vote these people back into power. Don't trust the government. Trust in yourself. Stay informed. But you have to accept the responsibility when you do make your own decisions. Because sometimes you might make a bad one. I hope you never do. But you might, and you have to accept the responsibility for that. But still, you're probably better off overall than you would be simply relying on the government to come save you. So that's all I have to say about this matter. Do not let this story die. I thank you guys for joining us. If you already have, please drop us a subscription here on YouTube. Give us a like, comment, thumbs up on Rumble, all the like options. You can hit the heart button on Twitter if you're over that way. Same thing on Instagram as well. We definitely appreciate you guys being here and tune in for more. So I've been Dan Weikart with Weikart Media. We'll catch you later.